Welcome to A Pair of Bookends, the book club you can carry anywhere. I'm your host, Hannah MacDonald, and I'll be bookending the conversation with some of the most exciting voices from the bookish world. Welcome to our bonus books episode for December. Today's episode is dedicated to The Ghosts of Paris by Tara Moss, which is out now and published by Verve. Tara Moss is an international best-selling author, documentary and podcast host, and former model. She is a passionate and inspiring pain and disability advocate and human rights activist. Tara is a UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador and has received the Edna Ryan Award for significant contributions to feminist debate and for speaking out on behalf of women and children. In 2017, she was recognised as one of the global top 50 diversity figures in public life. Her crime novels have been published in 19 countries and 13 languages, and her memoir, The Fictional Woman, was a #1 international bestseller. The Ghosts of Paris is the second in Tara's Billy Walker mystery series, and here to chat all about it, welcome Tara to A Pair of Bookends.
Thank you so much, Hannah. It's an honor to be here.
I am so pleased to have you here, but before we dive into you and your book, I have to ask my favourite question, which is, what are you currently reading?
So at the moment, I'm diving into Iona Wishaw's series, which is set in the 1940s. There's a woman in it who's quite fascinating, and a whole constellation of characters. And what I love about this is that it's got such an authentic 1940s feel. And it's actually set in BC, which is where I come from. So I was born and raised on Vancouver Island in BC. And to have something actually set in this region of the world is less common. You can see with my books, I'm setting them usually in big city centers, famous places like London and Paris that we see in the latest book. But I'm reading To Track a Traitor by Iona Wishaw, which is... It's not the latest, but it's one of the more recent in this series. And Iona Wishaw is very prolific. So there's over a dozen, I think, at this stage of these stories.
Wow.
I think that your listeners, if they enjoy the 1940s and they enjoy central female protagonists who are, well, let's put it straight, smarter than everyone else and figures things out, then they'll probably enjoy this series very much by Iona Wishaw.
Oh, that sounds great. I will definitely have to have a look at that. I want to ask, and I'm guessing from what you've just said, it could be the case, but is the genre crime and mystery, is that a genre that you've always loved as a reader? Because how did you come to start writing crime novels?
Well, I started off actually as a lover of Stephen King. So
Wow,
when
okay.
I was, when I was a kid, I started writing little stories, and I was basically like a little goth girl. And at age 10, I was writing Stephen King style novelettes for my classmates at elementary school. And I used to write them as choose your own adventure horror stories, if you believe it or not.
Wow.
Because 10-year-olds are morbid as well. So it was my friends at school asking to be written in and knocked off by these characters in these horror stories. And that was my, not very illustrious beginning as an author, because they were my first readership. And I was fascinated by the taboo of reading these like horror stories when I was really far too young to be able to read them, And that was back in the 80s. So when I published my first novel and finished my first full-length book, though, by then, I was much more interested in the crime and thriller genre, the mystery genre, because it's just kind of where I could bring in those aspects of, I guess, the life and death stakes that I found really thrilling, but also with maybe a little bit more realism and grit and sometimes more character development. And everybody's stories, they write and approach them differently, of course, but that's what really appealed to me, is the social commentary, the characters, and putting those characters in life and death situations. And so for me, historical mystery or thrillers are really a wonderful way to look at history, to look at human history, and also social commentary on what was happening at the time and how that kind of, it implies a glance at least at what is happening today. You sort of without that being central to the book, you
Hmm.
can't help but kind of think about, oh, this is how we got to where we are now. So it's a genre I love and have been writing since I was 25 and published my first book.
Wow. And your books have obviously been very successful. I mean, like I said in my intro, they're published in 19 countries and 13 languages, which is just amazing. And you mentioned Stephen King there, and I'm curious what authors within the genre that you write for have inspired you
Mm.
or you think might have inspired your style of writing.
I think Chandler, I do have to give a nod to because, Philip Marlowe's a fairly influential character for
Hmm.
me. I sometimes joke that my central protagonist, Billy Walker, who's a wonderful PI, that she's like Philip Marlowe as Ava Gardner, as a kind of progressive feminist, if you will, central figure,
Hmm.
as opposed to the classic grizzled male gumshoe that we're used to seeing in the genre. And one of the reasons why I wanted to write it like that is because those women existed at the time.
Hmm.
I researched very heavily, and there were women PIs at the time, but very rarely were they represented in the popular
Hmm.
culture until very, very recently. So we just really didn't, I want to say, celebrate those stories or explore that life experience until very, very recently.
Hmm.
And I like that about Billy. I like that she represents a kind of undertold type of story
Yeah.
about a certain type of woman during the 1940s who's a civilian who's doing extraordinary things. Ordinary people doing extraordinary things.
Hmm.
That's kind of what drives me. So yeah, I'd say Chandler's quite a big influence. Also, Carrie Greenwood, who's a
Hmm.
wonderful Australian author. She's quite prolific as well. And she quite famously wrote the Phryne Fisher series, which became Miss Fisher's Murder Mysteries. If any of your listeners enjoy that series, that's set in the 1920s, and she's a very different type of character. But again, I love the fact that Carrie Greenwood is always shining a light on social justice issues and doing it kind of in this thrilling and playful way in the genre. So it's the 1920s. Her main character's like wonderful. And, I kind of hate to use the word because we only really apply this to women, but she is like the epitome of the feisty 1920s kick-ass woman, right? And I love that about her, but I love that she uses the genre to make social commentary. And again, in terms of the genre, when we're looking at PIs, that's how it started. The genre really it started out as social commentary in a way that you really couldn't achieve in that golden age of crime writing with the upper class sort of teacup mystery. They're looking at, the working class,
Hmm.
what's happening on the street, what's happening to people who have immigrated to countries or who are doing it rough. And that appeals to me much more than focusing only on the upper classes.
I love that. When I was reaching for your book, I was really unsure if this genre was going to be for me because I've never really, I don't know how many books I've actually read in this genre, if any, but this was honestly such a great gateway into it. Like, I was obsessed. I could not put it down. And it's just so thrilling to read. And you're constantly left guessing. You're giving me twists at every turn. And there's just so much to uncover about these characters. I just loved it so much. And I think Billy Walker is such a great protagonist. I
Oh, thank
really
you,
loved
Hannah.
her. And I will get into her in just a moment. But I wanted to ask because you've dedicated this book to your mother. And I
Yes.
wanted to know if you could tell us a bit about why you wanted to dedicate it to your mother and
Hmm.
how your family's story played into this book.
Thank you, Hannah. Such wonderful comments there about Billy Walker. I'm glad you enjoy her. So for me, this book really, and this series, like Billy Walker and her universe, if you will, was really inspired by my upbringing, which was sitting around listening to stories when we could get them to talk about it, because people didn't like talking about the war, understandably.
Hmm.
But getting my Oma and Opa in particular, so my Dutch grandparents, to talk about what happened during the war. And that's my mum's parents. So the first in this series, The War Widow, was dedicated to them, and the second to my late mother, Janie. And when I was growing up, we would sit around and hear these stories. My opa was forcibly taken by the Nazis when they occupied Holland, the Netherlands, and he was taken to be slave labor at a munitions factory in Berlin. And he had young kids at the time and a wife, of course, my Oma, and he was taken from them. And, they didn't know if they'd ever see him again. And their Jewish neighbors, they never saw again. They were, put on a different train to a different type of camp. And my Opa was a baker by trade, and my Oma very bravely would smuggle flour and sugar in the hollows of her bicycle and ride across Holland all the way to Berlin to this munitions factory to deliver these smuggled ingredients. And he would bake bread in the munitions oven to bribe the foreman.
Wow.
So you've got this German foreman who, like a nice loaf of bread. Are you kidding me? Like that was worth gold back then, right? And so he would make this bread, got on the good side of this foreman. And the foreman eventually gave him a day pass to visit his family. And once he got outside, he ran for it. He commandeered, as he called it, he commandeered a horse and cart and went across a bridge at one stage, which had a checkpoint, and thought for sure he was going to be shot. And he made it through, and he walked all the way back home.
Oh my gosh.
So that's the kind of stuff that ordinary people did during the war. And I've chosen to set my books immediately in the post-war period because I do think there's been a lot of focus on the war itself, for good reasons, of course. But I wanted to focus on the impact on regular citizens. I didn't want to focus on the politicians, leaders, the military leaders and generals and all this, and the sort of, I'll say like the masculine stuff that we associate so much with World War II. I wanted to really look at like what happened to regular folks and how are they coping having done that stuff during the war, and what are they doing now? And that was part of what really interested me. And it interested me because I could see the long shadow of war and how it affects and changes people because it's what I grew up hearing stories about. So that was why I dedicated to my amazing late mom and the previous book, The War Widow, to her folks.
I love that. And I think it's so important, that we hear these stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things because those are the stories that, we need to elevate their voices, and it's hopefully something that we can learn from. And, war and lots of terrible things are still happening in the world, and there's still so much that we could be learning. And I think, even though this was kind of post Second World War, I think there's still so much of it that resonates now. It's whilst it's historical fiction, it's actually not entirely distant to what we see elsewhere in the world right now.
That's right. And also where we see things, let's say in the workplace, for example. So there's the issues of the gender pay gap, or how women are regarded in the workplace. There's issues of race, there's issues of sexuality, and these come up in my books, not because they're, necessarily central to the plot always, but they're part of people's, like real people's lived experiences at that time. And it does reflect on what's happening now. Like, it's not like these issues have actually been resolved or disappeared. Some of these issues have, improved significantly. Some have not. And even the ones that have improved, there's still a lag. There's still things that need to be improved and resolved. And it's only by looking at our history and how we got there that we can actually unpick some of the things we think of as normal. Like, for example, Billy has some friends that are in the workforce, in the police, in her, in Sydney, Australia. And just hearing from them and me doing the research at the time, it was like my head exploded, Hannah. It just drove me nuts. So no, the women, they had an allotted amount of women that they were willing to hire, which was a very small number. So the applications by far outweighed the number of people that they actually brought in who were women. So they were discriminated against by gender already just in getting hired. They were paid less. They weren't given a uniform. They weren't allowed a sidearm. And they also couldn't be part of the police association because they're women. And they were also not able to get any compensation if they were injured in the line of duty. And, and they couldn't get married. If they got married, they would be fired as well. And that was common in a few different jobs, actually, for quite a long time. So it's a good kind of reminder that we've had these improvements, that particularly unions have done a lot to collectively bargain around some of these issues and change them. But it's like we're still here. It's the end of 2024 as we're talking. It'll be maybe 2025 when this comes out, but it's not resolved yet. Those things are still happening. And I think that's a wonderful part of what historical fiction can provide us is we're enjoying ourselves. We're having a bit of a romp. It's a thrilling, action-packed story, but actually it does make us reflect a little bit as well. And I enjoy that combination.
Oh yeah, me too. And I wrote down a couple of different quotes from your book that I really loved. I mean, one of them is kind of, I mean, you explore these really important things, but there's also so much humor throughout the book. So it's told in, quite a light-hearted way. And there's a quote that I wrote down that was like how boring it was to live in a world so obsessed with the marital status of women. And they really are in this book. And I just don't think I appreciated how bad that used to be. And that's still an issue in lots of places in the world. So we're very lucky that, in some Western parts of the world that's not the case. But I don't think we're as much of a leap away from it as we like to think we are. There's a part in the book where Billy's told that she's not permitted to wear trousers in this hotel that she's in, and I was so full of rage. I was like, "How is this happening?" But I wanted to ask, what did you want to highlight about the sort of societal imbalances that women have faced in history?
I wanted to circle back to the trousers incident because it's a great example, I think. And I love that. So just imagine you've lived through a war. You've seen so much death, right? You've had so much trauma. You're a private investigator, like basically trying to save lives in many instances, right? And you walk into the Ritz Hotel in Paris, this beautiful hotel, and your perfectly gorgeous silk trousers, which are very fashionable, are not accepted. And they're like, no, you can't be wearing them in this hotel. You need to change immediately or be kicked out. And they're illegal in Paris. So it was illegal for women to wear pants in Paris. And this was until fairly recently. It was a law that was no longer enforced, sure, but technically it was still on the books until not so long ago. And it's an example of how ridiculous some laws are and also the attitudes. So was the owner of the hotel wanted to enforce that law. Even though if you think of the 1940s, of course, there were a lot of women wearing more what they called masculine clothes in factories and things like this. This was like the switch over from very feminine, pretty clothes and long hair. Suddenly it was like you needed to tie your hair up in a turban or a scarf and wear factory clothes or the skirt suits, which were often made from the absent men's suits, which were hanging in the closet. They would like adapt them into skirt suits, right? So they're wearing shoulder pads for perhaps the first time, and that more masculine look. And of course, she walks in these totally gorgeous, stylish trousers. It's like, this is not allowed here. And this is in the same hotel where only a couple years earlier, the Nazi high brass were actually staying in the hotel. There was one half of the Ritz Paris that was all the high Nazi brass because they loved that hotel, and the other half was like regular citizens, and it was a kind of Switzerland, if you will, in Paris, a neutral territory of a type. But it was sort of like, well, the Nazis were fine, but my trousers are
Trousers are
offensive
not.
to you. So it's just these really strange cultural attitudes that I wanted to highlight. And I think it's those little details, again, which are historically accurate. And apparently Marlene Dietrich, very famous for her menswear fashions and how she totally subverted the norms there. She was also told she couldn't wear her trousers at the Ritz Paris, right? So, so these historical details, they add a bit of richness. They're kind of fun as well, but they do give more of an idea of like what was actually happening on the ground, what kind of things you might encounter, whether it was because you were a woman, whether it was because you're gay, whether it was because you're Jewish or you're a German Jew who's fled from Germany before the war, and now you're being rounded up and put into a compound because you've got German background. Whatever it was that's put you in that situation, I think it's good as an author to just kind of highlight those things and make sure that we remember that how people are judged or what group they're thought to belong to actually used to have a very big impact on their lived experience. And to a large extent, it still does today.
It's absolutely mind-blowing, I think. And it's certain facts like that that spring out in the book that are just so hard to believe are real. And you think that Paris is, one of the most, if not the most fashionable place in the world. Like they love their fashion. And you think that they would allow for that kind of freedom of expression, but apparently not.
Apparently not.
Apparently
That's it.
not.
Yeah. And when you look, and I don't have the numbers in my mind right now, otherwise I'd share them. But if you even look at which countries allowed women to vote, France was kind of far behind. Actually. So even though they were very kind of progressive in some ways, they were quite backward in others. And it's just progress is, well, it's never a straight road to begin with. So, rights can be taken away at any time. And that's another thing that's, very much in the news as well today. But it is often surprising to look back and go, oh, wow, it's only, whatever the 50th anniversary of women being able to get their own bank account. Like, what? Yeah, that's something that most people, including my daughter, I hope never ever have to contemplate.
Yeah, absolutely.
They never
And
have to wonder.
well, yeah, let's hope not. Another thing that I wanted to speak about was another thing to do with rights and how progressive places may or may not be and how things have changed since or maybe not changed. And that's to do with the LGBTQ plus rights, which you write about in the book. And I have a quote as well that's you make a human urge taboo illegal and it goes underground. And I found it so fascinating the way that you wrote about this, because I think there's some representation of it, but there's still a lot more knowledge that people maybe don't have on these subjects. So I think it's always great to read about these things. And like I said, of course, we live in different times now, and the rights of LGBTQ people have maybe changed over time. But like I said, in some parts of the world, that's not the case. What was important to you when representing these experiences?
Well, one of the things I do as an author when I'm writing about the lived experience of characters who have been or who are part of, let's say, a group that have experienced oppression that I personally haven't experienced, I often like to get a sensitivity reader.
Yeah.
So I will get someone just to look over the content, and usually everything's all smooth sailing there, but sometimes again, I have more to learn, right? And so with the queer community, I've been wanting to write, I've actually got some queer characters in the book that haven't revealed themselves yet because it's the 1940s, but nonetheless, in this plot line, there is a queer storyline in there. Because one of the characters, a few of the characters, let's say, and it's just part of the lived experiences of the characters in the day. Queer people have always been here. They've always been around us. And it was very dangerous to be queer, or as they called it, to be a homosexual during the time of the Nazi regime meant that you were going to be exterminated, as were disabled people, as were Jewish people, as were girls who were considered wayward girls. There were, or Romani people, they're often called gypsies, which is not a great term, but they were all also exterminated. So it was important to me to kind of point those things out, those aspects of what the regimes did and how that was, and how despite that there's this incredible movement of resistance, that the spark of life and that drive to be who you really are, to express yourself and to have your desires be part of your life, that still was not snuffed out despite this incredible danger and pressure. And, Paris was one of those places where they still had a flourishing queer scene, if you will, even though it did have to go underground and they had to be extra careful. And I think that's really inspiring. I think the way ordinary people found ways to still be human in those extraordinary times is really inspiring. So I wanted to write that in. I just thought it was like a relevant part of the period. It's still relevant today, but it's good for us to look at again where things have come from and what the experiences are. And for me, that sense of like, I don't know, the indomitable spirit of these communities is just, it's very inspiring to me as a writer. Because whatever it is that we're going through, you can just know that people have survived and managed in their way to thrive in some of the most difficult circumstances imaginable through history. And that gives us some hope that we can do so today as well.
Yeah, it really does. And it's inspiring to read as a reader. So I can imagine, being able to immerse yourself in those stories as the writer was a really wonderful thing. And I do want to talk about your writing process and your research process specifically, because, there's writers that research and then there's your level of research.
Yes, I'm
Because
a bit peculiar.
this is next level research. I'm obsessed with this. So I read, and I don't know if this is true or not, but I believe that you actually earned a qualification as a private investigator. Is that true?
It is. Yes, I got my certificate 3, which is the modern day requirement for being a private investigator. What's interesting about that and all the study I had to do to get that certificate and that standing is that at the time, Billy Walker would not have needed it, actually. So I did all the things you need to do to be a professional PI today, but she just needed to open shop. Obviously, there's a lot of learning, like it's a tough job. She had to learn the ropes. And in this case, she was reopening her late father's private investigation agency, and she had her background as a war reporter, but also her familiarity growing up with her dad as a PI. So she was already kind of quite well set when she was starting out. But today you do need to actually study and you do need to be able to get your license. The only law specifically pertaining to the only legislation specifically pertaining to private investigators in Australia, where she has her agency, at the time was that you couldn't call yourself a detective. That blew my mind. I was like, what? So yeah, you could have a jail record. You could have all kinds of problems with, let's say, your character or your contacts in the world. You could be pretty dodgy, and you could set up and operate as a private investigator. You just had to call yourself a private inquiry agent or private investigator. You couldn't say private detective or the private dick that we're used to from the film noir films. They're always like private detective, as opposed to public detective, which would be your government, your police. Yeah, you weren't allowed to call yourself detective. They were very precious about the word detective at that time. So it blew my mind that, in Australia, they weren't called private detectives, and using that term or claiming to be one would get you in hot water. Just about everything else was pretty easy going.
That's crazy.
Yeah. So you could do jail time, and then, the moment you got off on bail, you could go do some more cases.
Wow. That's mind blowing.
Yeah.
So, what kind of things have you learned from training to be a private investigator? What was that like, and how much of it I imagine quite a lot of it played into your research for this book.
Well, I learned that I would be terrible at tailing people because, first of all, I'm like 6 feet tall and not
Oh my
very
gosh.
subtle in appearance, but tailing people for the work, which I did do. So I did go out on actual cases, and it was really uncomfortable for me. And although this is a legitimate job, and particularly in the 1940s, like women could not escape, let's say, an abusive marriage without the work of a private investigator to prove that their husband was cheating on them, would be like, that's the classic. You actually needed like photographs, right? So you couldn't get out of these horrible marriages without the kind of work that Billy Walker does. Having said that, following people around with a camera to document them having an adulterous affair is an extremely uncomfortable
Yeah, I can
job.
imagine.
And for me, I was like, this is so uncomfortable. I could do it, and I did it, but it was very weird for my brain to
Yeah.
follow someone around without them knowing that I was following them. I just felt very strange about it. Like my ethics were just in knots. I was like, this is a legitimate job. I'm here for research. I have to do this. But all the parts of me were just like, oh God, this feels so wrong. I shouldn't be doing this. And then somehow vindicated when the person actually did the thing they were accused of. Then I was like, oh, okay, well, I guess it's better that their wife knows. But the whole time I was thinking, what if it's this innocent person and I'm following them around? And I feel so creepy right now. So, I mean, that's me being a bit soft, if you will. Like any PI listening to this will be like, oh, come on, get over it, right? Like this is the stuff that happens every day in the world that we don't usually hear about or see. People are being tailed or surveilled, and that's a reality in our world, often digitally now, which they didn't have at the time. But it is uncomfortable. So that was one thing I learned was like, okay, I might have my credentials, but I'm maybe not going to be a PI. I can write about them though. And for me it was like kind of also learning about the things that people do to one another. And some of that is obviously not great. If you're looking at those worlds, and I did a lot of research with police as well, you're seeing a darker part of the societies that we live in. And that's part of why I like this genre, because you can write about difficult things, but researching them is even more difficult, of course, because you have to immerse yourself completely in order to get the authenticity on the page. I've got a kind of unwritten contract with readers of the Billy Walker series where I feel like what I want to deliver for you is a ride. I want you to start reading, to fall in love with Billy, want to be in the passenger seat as she's driving her fast car, taking you into dangerous places, and at the end that she's going to get you through okay, that you will have been entertained, you will have had a lot of like the full range of experience and emotion, and you're going to come out the other side in one piece. That's what I want to deliver to you, right? And when you do a deep dive as an author researching into some of these areas, you do have to find a way to kind of like pull yourself out occasionally, because it is really hard to repeatedly read about like the worst crimes of human nature, whether it's the Holocaust or whether it's, domestic violence or homicide. These are dark areas of human behavior. And those things are around and haven't stopped and have been around for a long time. And you have to make sure that you look after your well-being so that you don't get sucked into that black hole, basically.
I think you have managed to strike a balance of exploring really important and quite dark topics whilst also creating something that's incredibly entertaining, very gripping. It's very funny in parts as well. And I find it fascinating when writers are able to do this, because it's such a hard thing to do, isn't it? To strike that balance. But I want to dive into Billy because she is such a special character. And I do feel like for those people that read this book, there's no way that you're not going to remember Billy Walker forever. Like, she's just a fantastic character. How did she first come to you?
That's a great question, Hannah. She's a kind of amalgam, if you will, of the film noir women that I love, that I kind of, again, was part of my experience growing up and watching black and white movies. She's part of an amalgam as well of the incredible women of World War II, like Nancy Wake, who was, she was born in New Zealand and she was, I think, one of the most decorated or the most decorated woman of World War II. She was like dropped into, across the enemy lines during World War II, and she would be dropped in with, I kid you not, a satin pillow and her lipstick, as well as her pistol. And she killed Nazis with her bare hands, and she was this tiny, glamorous woman. There's people like Lee Miller, again, an incredible war photographer, quite famous for her war photography, but she was a surrealist model before then and a Vogue model. And Virginia Hall, who was a disabled woman. She had a prosthetic leg that she named Cuthbert from a hunting accident.
I love that.
And she did extraordinary things. And the list kind of goes on and on. And these are women who we should all know, like we should all know their names. And I guess Billy Walker is in a way an amalgam of a kind of, Ava Gardner as Philip Marlowe with a touch of, Martha Gellhorn, the war reporter, Lee Miller, Nancy Wake, just that courage and bravery of, I want to say, extraordinary women ordinary women put into extraordinary circumstances and becoming something quite legendary in the process.
Yeah.
That's Billy Walker. So she's been described as a fast-driving, fast-talking, champagne-swilling Nazi hunter, private investigator. And I'm like, yeah, that's the girl gang I want to be part of.
Oh, me too.
I want to have a champagne cocktail with Billy Walker at the dancers and see what happens next. And I feel like with Billy, when she's that fast driving Nazi hunter investigator, I'm like, yeah, I want to be in the passenger seat and see where she takes us. And that's the experience I want as a reader. So that's what I created.
I mean, you did a wonderful job of creating her, because I absolutely wanted to be in the passenger seat flying down the motorway with the top down and hair flowing.
Yes.
I love it.
Yes.
What is next for you in terms of how many more books are there for the Billy Walker mystery, if any? Is there anything you're allowed to reveal, or is it all very quiet secret?
So I will have a third book in this series. The first one is The War Widow.
Yes.
The Ghosts of Paris is, of course, the latest that's just come out with Verve in the UK. There's going to be a third one, a follow-up, which will come out in 2025. It's coming out in several different countries, and I don't have the UK date yet, but I do have the Australia, New Zealand date and the US and Canada dates roughly. So probably like end of 2025, something like that. We will have the third one in the series. And really, it will depend on what the characters want and what the readers want as well. And I really believe in both of those things. Like a story knows what, there's the kind of know-how, the story knows what it wants to be. And often as the author, you don't actually know until you're writing it. And then it tells you, the characters kind of tell you, and the readers do to an extent as well. So if there's a lot of love for Billy Walker and the characters are saying, yes, I want to do this and this, then I will just keep writing her.
I love that. So basically, everyone, go buy your copy right now. I'm popping a link in the show notes. So go buy your copy so we can show that that hunger is there. And we want more Billy Walker. I love her so much, and I really, really enjoyed this book. So thank you so much for writing it, Tara. I loved spending time with her. Before I let you go, I do have to round off by asking for a recommendation from you. So what would you like to recommend to the listeners?
So right now I'm also rereading my Carrie Greenwood favorite, Cocaine Blues. And this is actually
what a gorgeous cover.
It's gorgeous. So it's set in the 1920s. It's historical fiction, thriller mystery again. So in the same subgenre, if you will. And it's just a marvelous book, and it's what kicks off that character of Franny Fisher. And there are plot lines in there about women's rights, which really grabbed me. And I think what made me reach for it again is some of what's happening in the headlines in places like America. Just that coming to the fore made me think, yeah, Cocaine Blues by Carrie Greenwood. So that's my recommendation right now. If you want to dive into a fun but relevant read that takes you into the 1920s, where you've got a great female protagonist, I highly recommend Carrie Greenwood's book. And if you love that character, you've got many adventures to follow her on after that.
Oh, I love that. I am absolutely going to have to grab myself a copy, especially if the cover looks like that. It is gorgeous.
So marvelous. Very
It's
different from Billy
incredible.
Walker, but like, I feel like, and also they're different eras, but I feel like if they met, they would get on.
Oh, 100% from what you've said, 100%.
They would bond over champagne cocktails. We're very different
Yes.
women, but I get you. I get you.
I love it. Thank you so much, Tara, for joining me on a pair of bookends
Pleasure.
today. I've loved chatting to you. And as I said, I loved getting to meet Billy Walker and read The Ghosts of Paris. And I am so sad that she is not a real person.
I know, right? She's amazing. She's real to me. She
Yes,
lives in
and to
my
me.
she lives in my world all the time. I hope you enjoy the next book when it comes out. And it was just such a pleasure to chat with you, Hannah. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And for our listeners, where can they find you? Are you on social media? Have you got a website they can look for you?
Yeah, they can go to Tara Ray Moss. My middle name is Rae, Ray. So they can look me up. If you look up Tara Moss online, honestly, you'll find me pretty quickly. I'm on Instagram as Tara Moss Author. I've got the website Tara Ray Moss. I don't use Twitter much these days, but I'm on there too. So come
They can
find
find you
me, drop me
everywhere.
a line, find me on Facebook, Tara Moss Author. Drop me a line, and yeah, I love bookstagramming. So all those bookstagrammers out there are just amazing, supporting authors the way they do and keeping us
Yes.
excited about the latest books. So if you're one of those, I'll hopefully see you on there too, and we can have a chat about all things Billy Walker, the 1940s, and whatever else you like.
Absolutely. So go grab yourselves your copy of The Ghosts of Paris and go and tell Tara how much you love Billy Walker because I'm sure everyone, there's no way that you can't love Billy Walker. I am obsessed with this character. So if you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. And if you want to give us a follow, you can do so at A Pair of Bookends Pod on Instagram and at A Pair of Bookends on Twitter and TikTok. And lastly, yeah, thank you so much, Tara. I have loved chatting to you, so thank you.
You too, Hannah. Thank you so much.
And
Happy reading.
thank you, and thank you, listeners, for listening. Goodbye.